December 25th, 1916. As Miami's pioneer families gathered for modest Christmas dinners in their wooden frame houses, James Deering stood alone in the loggia of his newly completed palazzo, gazing across Biscayne Bay. The warm Florida breeze carried the scent of jasmine through the open arches of what would become America's most audacious architectural fantasy, a Venetian palace rising from the mangroves of South Florida. Behind him stretched 34 rooms filled with centuries-old European art, their value exceeding the entire assessed worth of the city of Miami. Beneath his feet, coral stone quarried by Bahamian laborers still bore the chisel marks of their back-breaking work. This was Vizcaya, a $15 million monument to one man's vision built on filled swampland by workers earning 50 cents a day. Today, tourists snap selfies in these same rooms, unaware that they walk through spaces once maintained by a staff larger than most Florida towns, or that this Mediterranean dream palace was conceived by a dying bachelor who would enjoy it for less than 9 years. How did a Midwestern farm equipment heir create Venice in the tropics? Why did he pour a quarter of his fortune into a winter home he barely lived to enjoy? And what dark truths lie beneath Vizcaya's pristine restoration? Chapter 1. The Impossible Palace. The morning of November 2, 1912, Paul Chalfin stood knee-deep in mangrove swamp, his Italian leather boots ruined, his white linen suit splattered with mud. The artistic advisor to millionaire James Deering surveyed 180 acres of dense jungle and tidal hammock on the shores of Biscayne Bay. Where others saw worthless swampland, Chalfin envisioned marble loggias, formal gardens, and a palazzo to rival the merchant palaces of Venice. The mosquitoes swarmed so thick that workers would later wear nets over their heads. The ground squelched underfoot, more water than earth. Yet within 4 years, this jungle would become the most expensive private residence ever built in America. James Deering had first visited Miami in 1910, when the entire city claimed fewer than 5,000 residents. The son of William Deering, co-founder of International Harvester Company, James had spent his life in the shadow of agricultural machinery and Midwestern pragmatism. At age 52, a lifelong bachelor with failing health, he possessed a fortune of $60 million, roughly $1.8 billion in today's currency. While his brother Charles built a sensible estate north of Chicago, James dreamed of something unprecedented, a winter palace that would transport him entirely from the industrial age that created his wealth. The numbers defied comprehension. The main house would contain 34 rooms arranged around a central courtyard. The gardens would span 10 acres of formal design. The project would employ 1,000 workers. At its peak, nearly 10% of Miami's population. The cost would reach $15 million, equivalent to $400 million today. But the most staggering statistic wasn't monetary. Deering intended to fill his palace with authentic European antiquities, entire rooms purchased from crumbling villas, ceiling frescoes cut from Renaissance palazzos, Roman altars shipped across the Atlantic. Paul Chalfin, a failed painter turned interior designer, understood his patron's obsession perfectly. Deering didn't want to build in the style of a Venetian palace. He wanted to create the illusion that a 400-year-old villa had been magically transported to Florida. Every detail must whisper age and aristocracy. New construction would be artificially aged. Modern conveniences, electricity, telephones, central heating, would be concealed behind ancient facades. Even the name reflected this fantasy. Vizcaya, a Hispanicized spelling of Biscay, suggested Spanish grandeur while honoring the bay at its doorstep. Yet the site itself fought against this vision. The coral ridge that would provide Vizcaya's foundation stone lay beneath thick jungle. Fresh water was scarce. The summer heat and humidity would destroy precious artworks. Hurricanes threatened from June through November. Construction materials would need to be barged in from the north, as no railroad spur reached the property. The closest skilled craftsmen worked in New York, 1,000 miles away. The transformation began with violence. Dynamite shattered the morning quiet as workers blasted through coral rock. Dredges groaned day and night, pulling fill from the bay bottom to raise the land above flood level. The natural shoreline, with its tangle of mangroves and sea grapes, disappeared beneath geometric seawalls. A Bahamian labor force, recruited specifically for their experience with coral stone, arrived to begin the crushing work of quarrying and cutting. They lived in temporary camps on the property, segregated from the Italian stoneworkers and Irish laborers who would arrive later. By Christmas 1912, the foundation was ready. But Deering had already spent $1.5 million, 10% of his total budget, and not a single wall stood above ground. His project would consume not just money, but human lives. 3 workers would die in construction accidents. Dozens more would suffer injuries from falling stone, infected coral cuts, and heat exhaustion. The local hospital, Holy Cross, would dedicate an entire ward to Vizcaya casualties. These stories wouldn't appear in the society pages that breathlessly covered the estate's progress. They were written only in hospital records and worker compensation claims, documents that would molder in archives while tour guides spoke of Deering's exquisite taste. As 1913 dawned, the real work began. Ships arrived weekly at the improvised dock, their holds filled with pink marble from Carrara, tile from Cuba, ironwork from Scotland. An entire Renaissance ceiling, purchased from a palazzo in Milan, arrived in 47 numbered crates. But the greatest import was human expertise. Deering hired Scottish engineer James Sturrock to oversee construction, bringing him from Andrew Carnegie's mansion projects. Italian artisans arrived to lay mosaic floors and carve limestone details. Hungarian woodworkers came to install the ancient boiserie. Each group brought their own methods, languages, and bitter rivalries that would explode into fistfights in the suffocating heat. Chapter 2. The Harvester's Fortune. To understand Vizcaya's excesses, one must first understand the machines that paid for it. Every silk tapestry, every marble statue, every gilded surface traced back to the wheat fields of America and the mechanical reapers that transformed them. James Deering never invented anything, never built anything with his own hands, never even ran the company that bore his family name. He was, in the parlance of his time, a gentleman of leisure. But his leisure was built on the bent backs of farmers and factory workers across the globe. William Deering, James's father, had started as a dry goods merchant in Maine before moving to Illinois in 1865. He invested in a small company making harvesting machines, eventually buying it outright and renaming it the Deering Harvester Company. By 1902, when the Deering Company merged with its rival McCormick to form International Harvester, the combined entity controlled 85% of America's agricultural machinery market. The merger created a trust so powerful that President Theodore Roosevelt would personally intervene to break it up, though not before the Deering family extracted their millions. James, the younger son, had been groomed for genteel management. After graduating from MIT, he joined the company as secretary, a position that required little beyond attending board meetings and signing documents prepared by others. His real education came through the grand tours of Europe that wealthy Americans undertook, absorbing art and culture like expensive wine. He learned to distinguish Venetian from Florentine glass, to spot genuine Gobelin tapestries, to appreciate the difference between Rococo and Baroque. This aesthetic education would become his life's work. The International Harvester Company, meanwhile, expanded globally with ruthless efficiency. By 1910, its machines harvested grain in Russia, Argentina, and Australia. The company employed 75,000 workers in factories from Chicago to Sweden. These workers earned an average of $2 per day. Decent wages for the time, but a pittance compared to the millions flowing to shareholders. James Deering's personal income from dividends alone exceeded $2 million annually, earning him more in a single day than his workers saw in 3 years. This disparity wasn't lost on Deering, but he rationalized it through the gospel of efficiency that International Harvester preached. The company's machines, after all, had freed millions from backbreaking manual labor. A single McCormick Deering reaper could do the work of a dozen men with scythes. This was progress, civilization, the American way. If progress also meant that wheat prices plummeted, driving small farmers into bankruptcy, that was simply market efficiency. If civilization meant that factory workers lost fingers in machinery accidents at alarming rates, that was the price of industrial advancement. But James Deering wanted no part of industry's harsh realities. By 1908, suffering from pernicious anemia that left him increasingly weak, he retired from active business. His brother Charles would continue building the agricultural empire. James would spend his remaining years and fortune creating beauty. He had no wife, no children, no heirs beyond nieces and nephews he barely knew. Vizcaya would be his offspring, his monument, his denial of the industrial age that birthed him. The irony ran deeper than Deering perhaps recognized. His Venetian fantasy celebrated a pre-industrial world of artisan craft and aristocratic leisure. Yet every aspect of its creation depended on industrial systems. The steel beams hidden within its walls came from Carnegie's mills. The concrete for its foundations required industrial Portland cement. The very ability to transport massive stone columns from Europe to Florida relied on steamships and industrial ports. Deering was using the profits of mechanization to build a shrine to the pre-mechanical age. This contradiction extended to his treatment of workers. At Vizcaya, he demanded old-world craftsmanship, but paid New World industrial wages. Skilled Italian stoneworkers earned $3 per day. Good money, but nothing compared to the $10,000 Deering spent on a single Roman altar. Bahamian laborers, doing the most dangerous work in the quarries, received just 50 cents daily. The estate's construction would ultimately employ over 1,000 workers, but Deering knew none of their names. They were as interchangeable to him as the parts in a McCormick reaper. Yet Deering saw himself as a benefactor. He provided steady work during construction. He built dormitories for workers, segregated by race and nationality, but clean and serviceable. He even established a commissary where workers could purchase food at cost. These gestures, common among enlightened industrialists of the era, allowed men like Deering to sleep peacefully in their silk-sheeted beds while their workers crowded into barracks. The money flowed endlessly. While a working family in Miami survived on $800 per year, Deering spent $50,000 on a single Beauvais tapestry. While the city struggled to fund its first public hospital, Deering imported an entire Baroque altar from a demolished Italian church for his private chapel. The local newspapers, dependent on advertising from Deering's various enterprises, portrayed this spending as civic blessing. Every dollar spent on Vizcaya, they argued, circulated through Miami's economy. They didn't mention that most of those dollars went straight back north in the pockets of imported craftsmen and art dealers. Chapter 3. Building on Broken Backs. The first man died on a Tuesday. Giuseppe Benedetti, a stoneworker from Tuscany, was positioning a marble capital when the rope snapped. 2 tons of carved stone crushed him instantly. The Miami metropolis reported the accident in 3 lines on page 4, noting only that a foreign worker had been killed at the Deering estate. His widow, back in Italy, would receive $500 in compensation, the price Deering paid for a minor Renaissance sketch. The transformation of mangrove swamp into Mediterranean palace required industrial-scale organization. James Sturrock, the Scottish engineer Deering hired as construction superintendent, ran the site like a military operation. Workers were divided into specialized crews: excavation, foundation, masonry, carpentry, decorative arts. Each crew had its own hierarchy, its own schedule, its own bitter rivalries. The Italians looked down on the Irish, who despised the Bahamians, who distrusted the local blacks, who resented them all for taking jobs. The Bahamian workers bore the worst of it. Recruited from Nassau and Eleuthera with promises of steady wages, over 200 men arrived in Miami to find conditions far harsher than advertised. They were assigned the quarry work, cutting coral rock under the blazing sun, breathing limestone dust that scarred their lungs, handling tools that regularly took fingers and occasionally lives. The coral itself was treacherous, its razor edges sliced through work gloves and skin. Cuts inevitably became infected in the humid air, turning septic within days. The camp doctor, overwhelmed with casualties, began each morning by deciding which infections could be treated and which men must be sent to the colored ward at Holy Cross Hospital. Samuel Knowles, a Bahamian mason whose grandson would later become a prominent Miami minister, left one of the few first-hand accounts of the quarry work. "The rock don't want to come up," he wrote to his wife. "We blast and cut and pry, but it fights us. Yesterday, young Thompson from Long Island got his leg crushed when a slab shifted. They took him away on a wagon. We don't expect him back." Knowles earned 60 cents per day, working 12 hours in summer heat that regularly exceeded 95 degrees. From this, he paid 20 cents daily for his bunk in the segregated dormitory and another 15 cents for meals at the camp commissary. His actual take-home pay, 25 cents per day. Above ground, the Italian artisans worked in relative comfort, installing the treasures Deering had purchased across Europe. These men, specialists in marble, mosaic, and fresco, commanded respect and wages to match. Carlo Romanelli, brought from Florence to oversee the installation of ceiling paintings, earned $5 daily plus a furnished cottage for his family. He worked in shaded rooms, handling priceless artifacts with cotton gloves. When he complained about the humidity damaging the frescoes, Deering immediately ordered installation of an experimental air cooling system, one of the first residential air conditioners in America. The Bahamian quarry workers, meanwhile, weren't allowed in the main house even to use the bathrooms. The accident reports, preserved in Dade County archives, tell stories the official histories omit. January 18, 1914. Negro worker fell from scaffolding, broke spine. February 3rd, Italian mason struck by falling beam, skull fractured. March 22nd, 2 workers overcome by fumes from chemical wood treatment, 1 died. April 9th, explosion in storage shed killed 1, injured 3. The deaths were attributed to worker carelessness, never to the pressure of Deering's impossible deadlines or the dangerous cost-cutting measures implemented as the budget spiraled beyond control. For Deering demanded speed above all. He wanted to spend Christmas 1916 in his completed palace, and he made clear that delays would not be tolerated. Sturrock drove the crews relentlessly. Work continued through hurricanes, with men tying themselves to scaffolding to avoid being blown off. Construction proceeded through the suffocating summer months, when temperatures inside the unventilated house exceeded 110 degrees. Several workers collapsed from heat exhaustion. They were revived with salt water and sent back to work. The skilled craftsmen, at least, could take pride in their creations. Antonio Battaglia, a Venetian specialist in terrazzo floors, spent 3 months creating the intricate patterns in the entrance hall. Each tiny piece of marble was hand-cut and individually placed. The design, copied from a palazzo floor Deering had admired, contained over 1 million separate pieces. Battaglia's work survives today, still gleaming after a century of footsteps. His name appears nowhere in Vizcaya's records. But for every moment of artistic triumph, there were days of grinding labor. The formal gardens required moving 15,000 cubic yards of earth, all by hand and wheelbarrow, as steam shovels would damage the coral rock underneath. The boat basin was dredged using manual pumps operated by crews working in shifts around the clock. The elaborate water features required laying miles of pipe through coral rock, each foot hand-chiseled by workers crawling through narrow trenches. The segregation was absolute. White workers entered through the main gate, passing the construction offices where they could voice complaints or collect pay. Black and Bahamian workers used a rear entrance near the quarries, collecting wages from a paymaster who often shorted them, knowing they had no recourse. The Italian workers ate pasta and wine in their own dining facility. The black workers received cornmeal, molasses, and occasional salt pork. When a group of Bahamian masons petitioned for better food, they were immediately fired and deported. By summer 1915, with construction entering its final phase, the workforce had swelled to nearly 1,000 men. The accident rate climbed proportionally. Exhausted workers made fatal mistakes. A carpenter named Patrick O'Brien fell asleep while working on roof tiles and tumbled 40 feet to his death. 2 electricians were electrocuted when someone activated a circuit they were repairing. A young Bahamian laborer, whose name the records list only as Boy, was crushed between 2 marble slabs being hoisted into position. Chapter 4. The Theater of Privilege. On February 22, 1917, Vizcaya opened its bronze doors to society. Deering, weakened by his worsening anemia but determined to play the perfect host, welcomed Miami's entire social register, all 60 families who qualified, to a Venetian carnival. Guests arrived in gondolas poled across the boat basin by Italian singers hired from New York. Colored lights strung through the live oaks created an enchanted atmosphere. The Miami Herald declared it the most magnificent social event in Florida's history, neglecting to mention that the reporter covering it was barred from entering beyond the reception hall. The illusion was complete. Guests wandered through rooms that seemed lifted from a European palace, because in many cases they were. The living room's ceiling had been cut from a Venetian palazzo and painstakingly reassembled. The reception room contained boiseries from a demolished French chateau. The dining room's table, a single slab of marble weighing 3 tons, had been carved in Italy for a cardinal who never lived to see it. Each room told a story of European grandeur transplanted, of history purchased and possessed. But maintaining this illusion required an army. Behind the tapestried walls, through concealed doors, moved a parallel world of servants. Vizcaya employed a full-time staff of 36, with dozens more brought in for events. The hierarchy was as rigid as any European court. At its apex stood Colin Simmons, the English butler Deering had poached from a British lord who earned $200 monthly, more than most Miami professionals. Below him ranked the housekeeper, Mrs. Adelaide Morrison, who commanded the female staff with military precision. Then came the under-butler, footmen, parlor maids, chambermaids, kitchen staff, and finally the scullery maids who started work at 4 a.m. to ensure hot water was ready when Deering woke. The daily routine bordered on the absurd. During breakfast required 3 servants, 1 to serve, 1 to pour coffee, 1 to stand ready with replacements for any dish that displeased him. His clothes were laid out by his valet, pressed by the laundry maid, and brushed by the hall boy. Fresh flowers, never the same arrangement twice, appeared daily in all 34 rooms, requiring 2 full-time gardeners just for cutting and arranging. The marble floors were washed nightly with imported Castile soap, then buffed to a mirror shine before dawn. The servants lived in a separate wing, carefully designed to be invisible from the main house. Their rooms were clean, but spare. Iron beds, thin mattresses, one dresser per 2 occupants. They were forbidden to use the main stairs, instead navigating through a warren of service passages that honeycombed the house. These passages, unventilated and undecorated, reached stifling temperatures in summer. The servants' dining hall, located in the basement, flooded regularly during high tides, requiring staff to eat with their feet on the chair rungs. Sarah Williams, a parlor maid whose diary was discovered during renovations in the 1990s, recorded the surreal nature of service at Vizcaya. Mr. D had us polish the silver twice today because a cloud passed over the sun during luncheon, and he said it looked tarnished. Marie fainted from the heat while cleaning the Marie Antoinette room. That's the 3rd girl this week. We're not allowed to open windows because the salt air might damage the paintings, but we're dying in here. The great events were worse. When Deering entertained, which was often despite his declining health, the staff worked 18-hour days. Every piece of crystal, over 1,000 items, was hand-washed and polished. The state china, a Sevres service that cost more than most Miami homes, required special handling. One broken plate meant instant dismissal. The tension in the service areas was palpable. Mrs. Morrison kept a flask of laudanum in her desk, dosing herself to steady her nerves. The guests, of course, saw none of this. They experienced Vizcaya as Deering intended, a seamless fantasy of aristocratic ease. William Jennings Bryan, 3-time presidential candidate and Miami resident, was a frequent visitor. He would hold forth in the loggia about the dangers of modern materialism, apparently oblivious to the irony of his setting. Charles Deering, James's brother, visited once and never returned, privately calling the estate "my brother's mausoleum." The entertainment reached spectacular proportions. For one party, Deering hired the entire Miami Symphony to play hidden in the gardens while guests dined. Another time, he imported a Shakespearean theater company from New York to perform The Tempest on the South Terrace. The actor playing Prospero, overcome by heat in his heavy costume, collapsed during the finale. The audience, thinking it part of the performance, applauded enthusiastically. But the most elaborate performance was Deering himself. The industrial heir played the role of Renaissance patron with exhausting dedication. He memorized the provenance of every artifact, ready to discourse on the history of a particular tapestry or the attribution of a dubious Tintoretto. He dressed in white linen suits and Panama hats, affecting a European formality that seemed absurd in Miami's subtropical casualness. He insisted on Italian being spoken at formal dinners, though most guests knew only a few phrases. The financial reality behind this theater was staggering. Vizcaya's annual operating budget exceeded $100,000, more than Miami spent on its entire school system. The fresh flowers alone cost $500 monthly. The electric bill, in an era when most Floridians still used kerosene lamps, ran $300 monthly. Deering spent $1,000 annually just on beeswax to maintain the furniture. The staff payroll exceeded $30,000 yearly, not counting the special bonuses Deering distributed to ensure loyalty and silence about his increasingly eccentric behavior. As his health declined, Deering's demands grew more bizarre. He insisted that the temperature in his bedroom remain exactly 68 degrees, requiring ice blocks carried upstairs hourly during summer. He demanded absolute silence after 8 p.m., firing a gardener for coughing within earshot of the house. Chapter 5. The Invisible Labor Force. Behind every polished surface at Vizcaya, beneath every manicured hedge, supporting every moment of Deering's cultivated ease, labored workers whose names history forgot. While guest books preserved the signatures of visiting dignitaries, no record remains of the laundresses who worked 14-hour days in the basement's steam-filled rooms, or the stable boys who rose at dawn to prepare carriages for guests who rarely acknowledged their existence. The invisible army that maintained Vizcaya extended far beyond the household staff. The gardens alone required 28 full-time workers. The elaborate parterre gardens, designed by Colombian landscape architect Diego Suarez to rival Versailles, demanded constant attention in Florida's aggressive climate. Every morning, crews of Cuban and Italian gardeners battled against nature's desire to reclaim Deering's formal geometry. They trimmed hedges that grew inches weekly, replaced flowers that wilted in the humidity, and waged endless war against the insects and fungi that threatened the imported European plants. José Martinez, one of the few garden workers whose name appears in employment records, oversaw the rose garden, 500 bushes of varieties bred for European climates and wholly unsuited to Florida. To keep them alive, he created an elaborate system of shade cloths and misting pipes, rising at 3 a.m. during summer to spray each bush with fungicide before the dew formed. His innovation saved the roses but destroyed his lungs. He died of respiratory disease at age 41, his widow receiving no compensation because the illness couldn't be proven work-related. The maintenance crew faced different battles. Vizcaya's location directly on Biscayne Bay meant constant assault by salt air. The bronze window frames required weekly polishing to prevent corrosion. The marble statuary had to be washed with distilled water to prevent salt deposits. The painted ceilings needed constant touch-ups as humidity caused the ancient pigments to flake. Thomas McKay, the head of maintenance, submitted increasingly desperate reports about the losing battle against decay. Deering's response was always the same: hire more workers, spend more money, make it perfect. The most hidden laborers were the children. While child labor was technically illegal in Florida by 1917, enforcement was non-existent. Boys as young as 10 worked as apprentices in the gardens, earning pennies while doing adult labor. They spread mulch in the blazing sun, hauled water for irrigation, and climbed trees to trim Spanish moss that Deering considered unsightly. Maria Romano, daughter of an Italian gardener, recalled decades later how she and other workers' children would sneak into the gardens before dawn to weed the flower beds, earning 5 cents for each basket of weeds collected. "We weren't supposed to be there," she remembered, "but everyone knew. Mr. Deering would walk past us like we were invisible." The racial dynamics of labor at Vizcaya reflected the broader inequalities of Jim Crow Florida. Black workers were restricted to the heaviest, dirtiest jobs, hauling coal for the boilers, emptying septic tanks, dredging the boat basin. They entered through a separate gate, used separate facilities, and were forbidden from the main house except for specific maintenance tasks performed when Deering was absent. Their wages averaged 40% less than white workers doing comparable jobs. When the head gardener tried to promote a skilled black horticulturist to oversee the orchid greenhouse, Deering personally intervened to prevent it, declaring that positions of responsibility must maintain appropriate standards. Yet these same black workers possessed knowledge critical to Vizcaya's survival. They understood Florida's soil, knew which native plants could survive, recognized the signs of incoming hurricanes. Sam Thompson, a Bahamian who worked in the gardens, repeatedly warned that the seawall was too low, that the drainage was inadequate, that the estate was fundamentally unsuited to its environment. His warnings were ignored as the opinions of an uneducated Negro. The 1926 hurricane would prove him catastrophically correct. Women workers faced their own particular hardships. The laundresses worked in basement rooms where temperatures exceeded 100 degrees, stirring vats of boiling water with wooden poles, their hands cracked and bleeding from the lye soap. The seamstresses, required to maintain and repair the elaborate curtains and upholstery, worked by candlelight to avoid electric bulbs that might fade the fabrics, straining their eyes until many were nearly blind by middle age. The kitchen maids rose at 4 a.m. to light the coal stoves, their arms permanently scarred from burns. The turnover was extraordinary. Between 1917 and 1925, Vizcaya employed over 500 different servants, most lasting less than a year. The official records list reasons for departure as resigned or dismissed, but servant letters tell different stories. "The beauty is poisoned," wrote Margaret O'Sullivan, an Irish chambermaid who quit after 6 months. "Everything glitters, but underneath it's rotten. The way they treat us, like we're not human. I won't stand for it, not for any money." Some found ways to resist. The servants developed elaborate systems to warn each other of Deering's approach, allowing them moments of rest. They borrowed food from the kitchens, sharing it with their families in Miami's poorest neighborhoods. They occasionally forgot to complete tasks they found particularly demeaning. One memorable incident involved the entire kitchen staff simultaneously developing food poisoning on the night of a party where Deering had refused to give them a promised bonus, but most simply endured, trapped by economic necessity. The Great War had disrupted European immigration, creating labor shortages that should have improved working conditions. Instead, Deering imported workers from the Caribbean and Central America, exploiting their vulnerability. These workers, often without legal documentation, accepted conditions that American workers increasingly rejected. They lived in fear of deportation, injury, or simply being fired without cause or compensation. The ultimate irony was that Deering genuinely believed himself a model employer. He paid wages at or slightly above prevailing rates. He provided housing and meals. He gave Christmas bonuses, $5 for servants, $10 for department heads. He saw himself as a paternal figure, caring for workers who should be grateful for his generosity. The fact that his daily breakfast cost more than a worker's weekly wage never seemed to strike him as significant. Chapter 6. The Hurricane's Reckoning. September 18, 1926, 4:47 a.m. The barometer at Vizcaya's boathouse dropped to 27.61 inches, the lowest reading ever recorded in Florida at that time. Winds exceeding 145 miles per hour transformed Biscayne Bay into a maelstrom of destruction. The storm surge, rising 15 feet above normal, crashed through Deering's carefully constructed seawalls like they were sandcastles. In 12 hours, nature reclaimed what 1,000 men had spent 4 years wresting from the wilderness. James Deering had been dead for exactly 1 year and 1 day. His nieces, Marion Deering McCormick and Barbara Deering Danielson, who inherited the estate, received the telegram in Chicago. Vizcaya devastated, main house flooded, gardens destroyed, staff casualties unknown. Please advise. The full scope of the catastrophe wouldn't be known for weeks. The hurricane had killed 372 people in Miami, left 40,000 homeless, and effectively ended the Florida land boom. But for Vizcaya, the storm represented something more profound: nature's violent rejection of Deering's impossible dream. The damage defied comprehension. The formal gardens, those 10 acres of European geometry imposed on subtropical swampland, had vanished. The great stone barge in the harbor, weighing hundreds of tons, had been lifted and smashed against the seawall. Ancient statues, purchased from Italian villas, lay shattered across the grounds. The boathouse had collapsed entirely. Saltwater had penetrated the main house to a height of 3 feet, destroying irreplaceable Renaissance furniture, soaking into frescoed walls, warping inlaid floors that had survived centuries in European palaces. But the human tragedy went largely unrecorded. The skeleton crew of 12 servants maintaining the estate had huddled in the main house as it flooded, certain they would die. The gardeners' cottages, built to lower standards than the main estate, were obliterated. Roberto Gomez, the head gardener who had replaced the deceased Jose Martinez, was found 2 days later, drowned in what had been the rose garden. His assistant, a young Cuban named Pablo Herrera, was never found. The official report listed 2 staff deaths, but workers later insisted at least 5 had died, their bodies washed into the bay. Sarah Coleman, the housekeeper who had replaced Mrs. Morrison, left a harrowing account in a letter to her sister. The wind screamed like all the demons of hell were trying to get in. The windows blew out one by one, even though they were boarded. The water came up through the floors. I didn't even know that was possible. We saved what we could, carrying tapestries and paintings to the second floor. But then the roof began to fail. Mr. Simmons had us abandon the house for the servants' wing, which was more sheltered. We spent 6 hours certain we would die. When morning came and we saw the gardens, or what had been the gardens, we all wept. The financial catastrophe matched the physical one. Initial damage estimates reached $3 million, 20% of the estate's total value. But the deeper loss was irreplaceable. The ceiling in the reception room, a 17th-century masterpiece, had partially collapsed from water damage. The pipe organ, custom-built in Germany at a cost of $50,000, was destroyed beyond repair. Salt had penetrated the very stones of the building, ensuring that decay would continue for years, regardless of restoration efforts. The Deering heirs faced an impossible choice. Restoration would cost millions they were reluctant to spend on a property they rarely visited. The hurricane had also destroyed much of their rental property in Miami, eliminating the income that supported Vizcaya's maintenance. The Great Depression, arriving 3 years later, would make the decision for them. They simply couldn't afford to fully restore or maintain the estate. Yet even in destruction, the class divisions persisted. Insurance covered the main house and its contents. Deering had paid astronomical premiums to Lloyd's of London. But the workers who lost everything received nothing. The gardener's tools, the servants' personal belongings, the maintenance equipment, all uninsured, all unreplaced. Workers were simply told to make do with whatever survived. Those who complained were dismissed. The attempted restoration revealed the fundamental unsustainability of Deering's vision. European plants couldn't survive in Florida's climate without constant intervention. The formal gardens required geometric precision that tropical growth patterns defied. The house itself, designed for Venetian weather, trapped humidity that rotted wood and corroded metal. Chief engineer William Porter submitted report after report detailing the losing battle. The estate is in fundamental conflict with its environment. We are not maintaining Vizcaya, we are perpetually rebuilding it. The hurricane had also revealed uncomfortable truths about the estate's construction. Where corners had been cut to meet deadlines or budgets, the storm had found every weakness. Decorative elements that were supposed to be solid marble proved to be plaster over wood. Ancient ironwork was revealed as recent reproduction when it rusted differently than genuine antiques. The foundation, built on filled swampland, had shifted, creating cracks that would plague the building forever. More disturbing were the discoveries in the servants' quarters. The flooding had exposed substandard construction that endangered workers' lives. Support beams were undersized. Drainage was non-existent. Fire exits were blocked or inadequate. The contrast with the main house's overbuilt luxury was stark and shameful. An anonymous letter to the Miami Herald asked, how many servants might have survived if their quarters had been built to the same standards as the rooms for Mr. Deering's art collection? The 1926 hurricane marked the end of Vizcaya as private fantasy and the beginning of its slow transformation into public monument. The Deering heirs, faced with astronomical maintenance costs and changing times, began selling off portions of the estate. The 180-acre property was reduced to 50 acres by 1945. The staff was cut from 36 to 10. The gardens were simplified, replacing European formality with hardier tropical plants. The dream was dying, but something else, perhaps more honest, was being born. Chapter 7. Metamorphosis into Monument. The transformation began with an ending. On a humid morning in August 1952, Marion Deering McCormick stood in Vizcaya's loggia, watching auctioneers tag the furniture her uncle had spent fortunes collecting. The Deering heirs, exhausted by 3 decades of hemorrhaging money, had decided to sell. But in a twist that would have amused James Deering's aristocratic pretensions, they were selling not to private collectors, but to Dade County, converting a monument to privilege into public property for the sum of $1 million. Barely 7% of what Deering had spent creating it. The negotiation had been tortuous. County commissioners balked at maintaining what one called a rich man's folly. The Miami Herald ran dueling editorials: preserve this treasure or demolish this embarrassment. The deciding vote came from an unexpected source. The hotel industry, which recognized Vizcaya's potential as a tourist attraction. People come to Florida expecting glamour, argued hotelier Morris Lapidus. This gives them Venetian glamour they can't find in Venice itself. But what exactly had the county purchased? An inventory conducted during the transfer revealed the estate's decay. Of 2,516 catalogued art objects, nearly 400 were missing. Sold quietly, over the years to pay taxes. Another 300 were damaged beyond repair. The gardens retained only shadows of their original design. The mechanical systems, heating, plumbing, electrical, were failing simultaneously. The new Vizcaya Museum would require immediate investment of $500,000 just to prevent collapse. The first museum director, Carl Weinhardt Jr., faced an impossible task: transform a private palace into a public institution while maintaining its essential character. His solution was radical honesty. Instead of hiding Vizcaya's contradictions, he would expose them. Wall labels would discuss not just the provenance of artworks, but the conditions of workers who installed them. Tours would include servant areas previously hidden from view. The museum would acknowledge what Deering never could: that Vizcaya was built on exploitation. This approach horrified Miami's old guard. Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt Whitney, visiting in 1954, complained that the museum was vulgarizing Vizcaya's refinement by allowing anyone to traipse through its rooms. The Miami Beach Society matron Mrs. Solomon Guggenheim suggested separate visiting hours for qualified guests versus the general public. These protests only strengthened Weinhardt's resolve. He instituted free admission days for Miami's Black community, previously barred from most cultural institutions. He hired Cuban refugees as guides, allowing them to give tours in Spanish. The restoration itself became a form of archaeology, revealing layers of deception. Workers stripping paint from a Renaissance ceiling discovered it was actually created in 1914 by an unemployed theater set designer from New York. A Roman statue proved to be cast concrete, artificially aged with acid. Even the famous telephone room, supposedly containing boiserie from a French chateau, included panels manufactured in a Chicago furniture factory. Each discovery forced curators to decide: preserve Deering's fiction or reveal the truth. They chose a middle path. The rooms would remain as Deering created them, but interpretation would acknowledge both authenticity and fabrication. This decision proved controversial. Art historians accused the museum of perpetuating fraud. Social historians argued for complete transparency. The public, however, seemed comfortable with ambiguity. Attendance grew steadily, reaching 100,000 annually by 1960. The civil rights era brought new reckonings. In 1963, protesters gathered at Vizcaya's gates, demanding acknowledgement of black workers who built the estate. The museum initially resisted, claiming incomplete records prevented proper attribution. But pressure mounted when researchers discovered photographs in the estate's archives clearly showing black and Bahamian workers, their faces purposefully obscured or cropped out for official documentation. Dr. Dorothy Jenkins, Miami's first black city commissioner, forced the issue by organizing a truth tour of Vizcaya in 1968. Standing in the Itoje quarry, she read names from newly discovered payroll records. Samuel Knowles, stonecutter; William Roll, carpenter; James Saunders, quarryman. These men built this beauty and were erased from its history. We restore their names today. The museum, embarrassed by the publicity, finally agreed to revise its narrative. The 1970s brought financial crisis. Maintenance costs exceeded revenue by 300%. The county threatened to close the museum unless it became self-sustaining. Director Carl Weinhardt Jr. made a controversial decision: rent Vizcaya for private events. The first wedding reception, held in 1971, sparked outrage. How dare they commercialize Deering's sanctuary? But the $5,000 rental fee paid for urgently needed roof repairs. Pragmatism trumped purity. Soon, Vizcaya became Miami's premier event venue. Fashion photographers shot models against Baroque backdrops. Movies used the estate as stand-in for European locations. Corporate events filled the gardens monthly. Each rental brought needed revenue but also wear and damage. The museum was caught in an impossible paradox. To preserve Vizcaya, they had to exploit it, just as Deering had exploited workers to create it. The transformation was complete by 1985, when Vizcaya achieved National Historic Landmark status. The estate that began as one man's private fantasy had become public patrimony. But the fundamental questions remained. What did Vizcaya represent? What stories should it tell? The answer would continue evolving, shaped by each generation's struggle to reconcile beauty with the brutality that created it. Chapter 8. Unearthing Silenced Voices. The manila envelope arrived at Vizcaya Museum on March 15, 1994, with no return address. Inside, curator Lori Osman found 12 sepia photographs and a handwritten note. "My grandfather built your palace. His name was Samuel Knowles. He deserves to be remembered." The images showed black and Bahamian workers at Vizcaya, circa 1914, carrying stones, mixing mortar, carving coral. Their faces, clear and dignified, contradicted decades of official history that had rendered them invisible. This discovery initiated Vizcaya's most profound transformation, from monument to one man's wealth into a site of recovered memory. The photographs, donated by Knowles's granddaughter Elmira Knowles Johnson, revealed what institutional archives had suppressed or destroyed. Here was evidence of the literally hundreds of black workers whose labor created Deering's fantasy, workers whose names appeared nowhere in the museum's exhibitions or publications. The revelation came at a critical moment. Hurricane Andrew had just devastated South Florida, causing $25 million in damage to Vizcaya. As restoration crews worked, they made additional discoveries. Behind a false wall in the servants' quarters, they found a cache of personal items: letters, photographs, a hand-drawn map of Nassau, rosary beads, a child's wooden toy. These artifacts, hidden for 8 decades, belonged to the Bahamian workers who had lived in these rooms. Each item told a story the museum had never acknowledged. Dr. Marvin Dunn, historian at Florida International University, led the effort to reconstruct these erased narratives. His team interviewed elderly Miami residents whose parents and grandparents had worked at Vizcaya. The stories that emerged challenged everything the museum had presented as history. According to these accounts, the Bahamian workers hadn't been mere laborers, but skilled craftsmen whose knowledge of coral construction was essential to Vizcaya's creation. They had developed techniques for cutting and treating coral that prevented deterioration. They had solved engineering problems that baffled European contractors. "My father designed the seawall," insisted 82-year-old Clarence Roll, son of master mason Timothy Roll. "The Scottish engineer's plan would have failed. Papa knew how coral settles. He drew the corrections in the sand, and they built it his way. But the engineer got the credit and the bonus." Documentary evidence supported Roll's claim. Payroll records showed Timothy Roll earning the same as unskilled laborers, despite responsibilities matching those of European foremen earning 5 times more. The archaeology of inequality extended beyond construction. In 1996, ground-penetrating radar revealed an unmarked cemetery near the estate's boundary. Excavation uncovered remains of at least 15 individuals buried without markers between 1914 and 1920. Forensic analysis suggested these were workers who had died during construction, the ones whose deaths went unrecorded in official documents. The discovery forced Vizcaya to confront its founding violence directly. The museum's first attempt at acknowledgement, a small plaque installed in 1997, satisfied no one. Community activists demanded comprehensive reinterpretation. They wanted the Bahamian dormitories restored and opened to the public. They wanted worker names added to room labels. They wanted the unmarked graves properly memorialized. The museum resisted, citing costs and historical complexity. The standoff broke when graduate student Maria Rodriguez discovered Vizcaya's most damaging secret while researching her dissertation. In correspondence between Deering and his construction manager, she found discussions of deliberately destroying worker documentation. "The Negro question grows troublesome," Deering had written in 1916. "Best if no permanent record exists of their numbers or organization." The manager had replied, "Records will be adjusted accordingly." This smoking gun transformed the conversation. The erasure hadn't been accidental, but deliberate policy. The museum could no longer claim ignorance. In 1999, new director Joel Hoffman announced a comprehensive reinterpretation project. "Vizcaya's story isn't just about James Deering," he declared. "It's about everyone who built, maintained, and preserved this place. We will tell all their stories." The process proved painful. Some docents, who had given the same tours for decades, resisted changing their narratives. Major donors threatened to withdraw support if the museum became political. The Deering Family Trust expressed concern about tarnishing James Deering's legacy. But Hoffman persisted, supported by a new generation of curators committed to inclusive history. The breakthrough came through art. In 2001, Bahamian-American artist John Beadle created an installation called Invisible Hands in Vizcaya's gardens. Using ground coral and construction tools found on the estate, he created ghostly silhouettes of workers throughout the grounds. The figures appeared at dawn and dusk when light hit them perfectly, then vanished, a metaphor for historical erasure and recovery. The installation's popularity convinced skeptics that confronting difficult history could enhance rather than diminish Vizcaya's appeal. Technology enabled further discoveries. In 2005, digital enhancement of deteriorated photographs revealed previously illegible faces and details. Names written on tool handles became readable. Worker graffiti, painted over but visible under special lighting, emerged on basement walls. Each revelation added texture to the simplified narrative of Deering's genius and taste. The most poignant discovery came in 2008, when renovators found a time capsule hidden by workers in 1915. Inside were photographs of families in the Bahamas, a letter in Creole describing working conditions, and a Bible with marked passages about justice and deliverance. The workers had known their stories would be erased and had tried to preserve them for future discovery. The letter concluded, "We build this palace but cannot enter. Our children will not know we were here. God sees all." Chapter 9. The Gilded Paradox. Today's Vizcaya presents a carefully curated contradiction. Each year, 300,000 visitors pay $25 to wander through rooms that cost more to maintain than most Americans earn annually. Instagram influencers pose against Baroque backdrops, their posts tagged to our villa vibes and half on our gilded life. Weddings starting at $50,000 fill the gardens most weekends. The museum generates $12 million annually, yet still operates at a deficit, requiring taxpayer subsidies to survive. James Deering's impossible dream remains impossibly expensive, a burden shifted from private fortune to public coffers. The ironies multiply at every level. Vizcaya markets itself as Miami's Gatsby, celebrating the very excess that destroyed its creator. The museum shop sells $200 coffee table books about sustainable living printed on paper from old-growth forests. Environmental tours discuss climate resilience, while air conditioning pumps constantly to preserve artifacts in Florida's humidity. The estate that epitomized inequality now hosts corporate diversity galas, where executives toast inclusion with champagne that costs more than minimum wage workers earn daily. Dr. Paul George, resident historian at History Miami Museum, articulates the paradox. Vizcaya forces us to confront the American contradiction. We celebrate democratic ideals while venerating aristocratic fantasy. We condemn inequality while paying admission to admire its fruits. The estate is simultaneously our aspiration and our accusation. The numbers tell their own story. Maintaining Vizcaya costs $8 million annually, more than Miami-Dade County spends on dozens of community centers combined. The orchid collection alone requires $100,000 yearly. Air conditioning the main house costs $50,000 monthly during summer. Each restored room costs approximately $500,000, with ongoing maintenance of $25,000 annually. The estate employs 95 full-time staff, though unlike in Deering's time, they receive benefits and living wages. Still, the lowest-paid groundskeeper earns in a year what the museum spends on orchid fertilizer. Climate change adds urgency to these contradictions. Vizcaya sits merely 3 feet above sea level. King tides now regularly flood the gardens. The 2017 Hurricane Irma caused $6.5 million in damage, more than the estate's entire annual budget. Engineers project that without massive intervention, rising seas will claim Vizcaya within 50 years. The proposed solution, a $30 million seawall and drainage system, would cost more than Deering's original construction, adjusted for inflation. Yet Vizcaya's cultural value transcends mere economics. The estate has appeared in countless films, from Any Given Sunday to The Money Pit, becoming visual shorthand for American excess. Fashion photographers consider it essential backdrop for luxury brands. The museum's Instagram account has 150,000 followers, each post carefully composed to hide scaffolding, erosion, and decay. The image matters more than reality. A dynamic Deering would have understood perfectly. The educational programs reveal deeper tensions. School tours bring 30,000 students annually, many from the same neighborhoods where Vizcaya's builders lived. Teachers struggle to explain how one man could spend millions on a winter home while their students' families struggle to pay rent. How do you tell kids living in poverty that this is their cultural heritage? Asks Maria Santos, a 5th-grade teacher from Homestead. They see the beauty, but also the injustice. Some get angry. They should be. The museum has attempted reconciliation through community programs. Free admission days attract thousands from underserved neighborhoods. Job training programs teach restoration skills to at-risk youth. The gardens grow vegetables donated to food banks. These efforts, while admirable, barely dent the fundamental inequality that Vizcaya represents. As activist Carmen Perez notes, they're offering crumbs from a banquet table. The structure itself remains a monument to exploitation. The preservation debate exposes competing values. Architectural historians insist Vizcaya must be preserved, exactly as Deering created it, including its exclusions and erasures. Social historians argue for radical reinterpretation that foregrounds worker narratives and colonial exploitation. Environmentalists question preserving any building so fundamentally unsustainable. The public, polls suggest, simply wants beauty without guilt, history without heaviness. Recent controversies have sharpened these conflicts. In 2019, a quinceañera photo shoot went viral when the family was asked to leave for bringing too many guests. The ensuing debate about access and cultural sensitivity revealed deep divisions. Who owns Vizcaya's spaces? Can a public museum restrict how communities use it? The museum's awkward response satisfied no one. The COVID-19 pandemic forced another reckoning. With tourism collapsed, Vizcaya faced bankruptcy. Emergency funding kept doors open, but staff was slashed. The workers deemed non-essential, groundskeepers, maintenance, security, were the same categories Deering had exploited. Their absence became visible as gardens grew wild, repairs went undone, and the fantasy crumbled without constant labor to sustain it. Now, as Miami booms with new money from cryptocurrency and tech ventures, Vizcaya faces fresh challenges. Developers eye its 50 acres hungrily. The land value exceeds $500 million. New millionaires want to rent the estate for increasingly elaborate events. The museum needs their money, but fears becoming merely a backdrop for wealth display. The current director, Joel Hoffman, walks a tightrope. We must generate revenue without betraying our mission. But what exactly is that mission? To preserve Deering's vision? To tell suppressed truths? To serve community needs? These goals often conflict. The answer may lie in embracing rather than resolving contradictions. Vizcaya stands as America's most beautiful cautionary tale, a masterpiece built on exploitation, a cultural treasure that embodies inequality, a public good maintained at public expense for private origins. Chapter 10. The Reckoning. The sun sets over Biscayne Bay, painting Vizcaya's facade the color of old gold, or old blood, depending on your perspective. The last tourists have departed, their selfies uploaded, their wonder and discomfort already fading. The security guards begin their rounds through rooms where men died installing ceilings, where servants collapsed from heat exhaustion, where beauty was built on suffering rendered invisible. Tomorrow, 800 more visitors will arrive, each paying admission to witness what money can create when it recognizes no limits, and what it destroys in the process. Vizcaya endures as America's most elaborate haunted house, haunted not by supernatural spirits, but by historical truths we struggle to reconcile. Every restored fresco, every manicured hedge, every carefully curated gallery label represents a choice about which stories we tell and which we bury. The estate that James Deering built to escape the modern world has become a mirror reflecting our contemporary struggles with inequality, sustainability, and historical justice. The numbers remain staggering. One man spent $400 million in today's dollars to build a winter retreat he occupied 3 months per year for less than 9 years. The workers who built it earned collectively less in their lifetimes than Deering spent on a single ceiling. The museum now spends more on air conditioning than the city of Miami spent on public health when Vizcaya was built. These disparities aren't historical artifacts. They're patterns that persist, visible in every luxury development rising along Biscayne Bay, in every service worker commuting hours because they cannot afford to live where they work. Yet dismissing Vizcaya as merely a monument to excess misses its complex significance. The estate preserves artistry and craftsmanship that would otherwise be lost. It provides jobs, education, and cultural enrichment. It offers beauty in a world increasingly dominated by utilitarian ugliness. The question isn't whether Vizcaya should exist. It does, immutably, but what we should learn from its existence. The lesson might be this: beauty without justice is hollow. History without truth is propaganda. Preservation without reckoning is complicity. Vizcaya challenges us to hold multiple truths simultaneously, to admire the artistry while acknowledging the exploitation, to preserve the treasure while exposing its costs, to celebrate human achievement while mourning human suffering. As seas rise and storms intensify, Vizcaya's future grows uncertain. Perhaps that uncertainty is fitting. The estate stands as a gorgeous warning about unsustainability, a cautionary tale literally dissolving into the ocean. Whether we preserve it or let it go, whether we continue investing millions in maintenance or allow nature to reclaim Deering's fantasy, we must recognize what Vizcaya truly represents: the beautiful, terrible extremes of American ambition and the hidden costs that someone always pays. Will you visit? Will you look beyond the surfaces? Will you remember the names? Samuel Knowles, Giuseppe Benedetti, Jose Martinez, Sarah Williams, of those who built paradise and were barred from entering it? The choice, like the burden, is now ours.